So I'm Nate. As Clive mentioned, I did my MBA at the University of Oxford. My focus was mainly on marketing, so a lot of what we just heard from Timothy and Lawrence. I also had the ability to study and learn as well. I'm going to talk about it from a different context, though. So I'm going to try to talk about it more in the form of personal storytelling, because I think in today's day and age, even if we're not digital marketers for our day job, whenever we are, using social media or using the internet online, we are in ourselves a personal brand, whether we like it or not. I think most of us, sometimes the people that you meet, you'll meet them online first before you ever meet them in person. So I think, we might as well own our brand or own our voice in terms of how people see us online. So I hope that this uh, brief presentation can kind of impart some tips that I've learned. I'm no expert, but certainly, hopefully I can impart some tips that I've learned to become a better storyteller. So aside from my studies, I also worked for an NGO in Hong Kong doing communications as a communications manager for the world's largest education prize, where I also kind of use some of these tips. And as well, while I was studying in university, I was an official blogger. So I was an official storyteller for my university at Oxford. So yeah, let's get started. So basically, as far as the presentation flow, I'm going to start off with just a brief history about why storytelling, has been around for so long and the science behind why it's so effective. And then I'm going to move on to talking about how digital storytelling now is a form of personal branding. With the omnipresence of social media within our lives, it's certainly a way that we project ourselves to the world. And then thirdly, I'll just kind of go over a few tips. And then I'm going to also, after that, kind of try to relate this specifically to the Phoenix Foundation. So maybe in terms of overcoming adversity or personal stories of resilience, how those life stories can be expressed through storytelling online. And then finally, if we have time, any questions that you have, I'm certainly happy to try to help answer. So let's get started here. So just a brief history of storytelling. So really, I mean, storytelling has been around for as long as we've been around as human beings, and even before that. So, I mean, there have been excavations where they found Neanderthals cave paintings. So this is before even, us as Homo sapiens. But as far as Homo sapiens, I guess the earliest confirmed cave painting would have been from around 30,000 BC in Indonesia, around the island of Sumatra. So back then, our ancestors would basically draw on caves or paint on caves to tell stories about, for example, spiritual rituals, or where their last hunt was and where they found this big game that they were able to kill and feast on. So those are kind of the earliest examples that we have of us as Homo sapiens using a form of storytelling through cave paintings. Now, if you fast forward to about 3500 BC. That's when we actually had the first form of writing in the form of cuneiform writing, which basically in modern day Iraq, which used to be Mesopotamia, back then the ancient Sumerians would basically write on clay tablets. And they found and excavated these forms of the earliest type of writing from about 3500 BC. And then if we, kind of fast forward again to about 1600, the 17th century, if back then in Europe, in the salons of Paris, you would have kind of housewives gathering to tell fairy tales. So fairy tales are basically born around that time, around the 17th century. And at the same time, not too far from Paris, in Germany, we saw the rise of the world's first newspapers. So newspapers also took place, or first, took place in Europe as well, from Germany to Italy, and then obviously they spread across the Atlantic to North America. So around the 17th century, we began to see fairy tales and modern newspapers beginning to tell narratives to the masses. And then in the 20th century, in 1900, was when we had the motion picture boom. So this was both on both sides of the Atlantic. So both in the UK and in the US, we had Thomas Edison and different inventors basically perfect the motion picture. And you began seeing certain people, not all people, but the wealthy class being able to watch and consume motion pictures in the comfort of their own home from the beginning of the 20th century. And then I think, as Lawrence I think touched on as well. So in 1939, we began to see kind of a network television. So that's when homes began getting access to at least 10 to 20 channels that they could watch, and that was the rise of television. And then in the mid 1990s, this was finally something where I was personally alive to witness. We saw the internet, or the World Wide Web, began to take the world by storm, began to be used by everyone almost in the mid 1990s. So I personally remember back in 94 or 1995 using free software or free websites such as GeoCities and AngelFire to make your own webpage. So basically that was when kind of anybody could have gone a computer, gone an internet connection, and told their story online without having to go through a different authority to express directly kind of their personal stories. That was a really powerful moment. And then, most recently, I guess, in 2003 and 2004, respectively, we saw both LinkedIn and Facebook launch. And, obviously LinkedIn for professional purposes and Facebook for personal purposes. That was when we each kind of had this social media platform to tell our stories. So now that I've kind of talked about the history of storytelling, what really is the science? Like, why is a story so effective? Why does it work? So basically, studies have shown that there's three main chemicals that get released when human beings hear a good story. And these are dopamine, cortisol, and oxytocin. So basically with dopamine, basically, it's a chemical that regulates our emotions. So if you hear a good story, it basically spikes your dopamine so that the sensation of hearing that story is a pleasant one, which means you would want to continue to hear from that person telling that story. As well, the other chemical is cortisol, which basically helps to produce memories. So if you tell a good story, studies have shown that cortisol also gets released in the brain of the person hearing your story, and then they in turn remember that story. So it lingers on as an experience that they can remember, which is very powerful, because any story you tell, you want that story to remain in the mind of who you're trying to influence, or who you're trying to persuade. And then lastly, with oxytocin, basically, this is a chemical that helps to form a connection. So basically, it regulates empathy. So when you hear a story, a good story from somebody, by spiking up this chemical, you feel a sense of connection or empathy to the person telling the story. And that's huge, because anytime you want to tell a story, really the main reason you want to tell it is to connect with another human being. So this is kind of the science behind why telling a story is so important. And both in, if you're marketing for your job, or in person, if you're just telling a story about yourself, the reason why it always works well to start off with a good story is because once you start off with a good story, once you have these three chemicals being increased or being spiked up, that's when whatever you say next, the facts that you want to share, or the product that you want to sell, or even it's you that you want to kind of sell to somebody, as far as being an employee, or being the next student at that program, or being whatever the case may be. Once you have that person hooked, then you tell that story, or then you tell those facts. That's when you really have their attention. So that's kind of the science behind why what we're about to talk about, as far as the tips about storytelling, are ever so important. So I guess one of probably the most iconic storytellers of our lifetime is, of course, Steve Jobs. And through his power of his personal story, and of how he was able to shape the narrative around Apple, he's basically changed and revolutionized all of our lives as far as all the products that we use. So he had a very powerful quote, and that was that the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller, And the storyteller sets the vision, values, and agenda of an entire generation that is to come. So that just kind of underscores how powerful being a storyteller can be. And we'll actually go back to talking more about Steve Jobs towards the end of this presentation. So let's now kind of focus on the digital age, which we all inhabit right now. So really, if you think about it, digital storytelling is so important in every facet of our modern day life, whether it's trying to get into a university program and you have to apply online and have to write a personal essay, or if it's applying for a job, either through LinkedIn or through a job site, being able to express your resume or your credentials in a way that is memorable is very important. Even in your personal life, what I think I read a study the other day from Stanford that over half of couples today met online. So basically, when you're meeting online, dating, you're basically telling an online story. And if you want to attract that partner, your story better be a good and a believable one. So definitely, online dating is one more example of where storytelling becomes very important. And in today's kind of sharing economy, for example, I use Airbnb a lot. So whenever I want, as a customer, to go to a different city, whether it's say Taipei or Tokyo, I might look on Airbnb to see different places that look like a good deal. So you'll have the host write about their accommodation or post photos. So they definitely would want to be able to frame or depict their accommodation in a way that is appealing and that would attract me to want to live there. So kind of in every facet of your life in 2020, you're going to have to tell a story to somebody. So that's kind of why it's so important that we try to master this art of telling an effective story. And I mean, even if you don't want to tell a story, I mean, in a sense, your story will be told for you. I mean, there's sites that you've probably seen. I know I've seen it where I haven't even used this website, but there's certain websites like I think Zoom Info where it will aggregate data about you, like all the places you've worked, all the schools you've studied, and basically form an online profile for you so that if you went to that page, you might think that that person made it, but you actually didn't make it at all. So your story will be told by somebody if you don't own and control that story, which is all the reason why it's so important to control your narrative. That will lead us to the tips that we're going to talk about in the following few slides. So what kind of mediums do we have for digital storytelling? Really, there's three main types. So there's the written version. So this might, for example, include blogs. Whether it's blogging on LinkedIn, whether you have your own personal blog on Blogspot or any of the kind of more old-fashioned blogging sites, or one I really like is Medium. Medium, which I actually have a screenshot of after, is a really effective tool and a really visually appealing tool to kind of write articles that most, I think, influencers that focus on the written word tend to utilize the most these days. Of course, you also have, the power of video. So YouTube being, the prime example of that, as far as being able to tell a story using video. And then now, I guess, especially with COVID-19 and how we're all on Zoom like we are right now, basically more live events that are unscripted, whether it's through a live podcast or through a live webcast. Basically, you're seeing more and more of these live unscripted events happen as well. So being able to tell your story without a script and have it be effective yet authentic and not too rehearsed is something that most people I think kind of want to hear from. So these are kind of the three main types of digital storytelling mediums that we have today. So really, what are the goals that you should have when you try to frame a story? So I'd say that there's 5 main goals. The first, again, going back to, about building that connection. So really, any story you tell, the underlying purpose must be, if it's an effective story, to build that emotional connection with your target audience. Basically, what you're doing is you're implanting an experience in their head. So if your story is, whether it's a very inspiring one, if it's a very inspiring one, you want to basically take that inspiration from you and plant that in someone else's head so that they feel it for themselves. And so basically, it's really important that you build a story that can convey that connection, can transmit it from you to them. As well, secondly, it's really important that when you tell a personal story, especially if you're wanting to apply for a new job or to apply for a university program, that you want to be, to join that next year, it's really important that your story it conveys your personal brand. So you want your brand to be unique and also some brand that people will remember, because for every job that you apply, there might be 50 or 60 other applicants applying for the same job, and the same would apply to a university program. So you want to make sure that your story is a story that is not just a statistic. It's a story that people will remember, and that employer or that admissions officer will want to hear from you again. So it's really important that your story is both unique and memorable. And as well, in that process of telling that story, it's really important that you're authentic and that you create trust, because I think most people are very intelligent. I think they can tell if what you're saying is not truly you, or if you're speaking in a fake voice or expressing a fake experience. I think most people have a pretty good gut sense of what's authentic and who it's coming from. So it's really important that you be authentic, and that the stories that you tell and that online personality that you kind of cultivate is consistent throughout whichever social media platform that you use. And that in turn will create trust. It will make people want to trust you, whether it's a new employer or a new classmate or teammate or partner. You definitely want to have people's trust. As well, it's really important, I think, that in your story that you tell, you want to highlight your strengths, but at the same time, not sound too much like a resume. People, employers read enough resumes, hundreds a day. You don't want it to come off as kind of just in a bullet point form listing all your strengths. You want to, I think, use the arc of your story, embed within that story your values as a person or your character, or especially when it comes to adversity, what you've overcome to become what you are now. You want to find a way in your story to either visually or verbally to express that, because I think once you articulate your values and character within your story, that will attract what you want to attract into your life, whether it's that dream job that has a work culture that you want, or that dream program where you feel like in that program you're going to meet classmates that truly you have a lot in common with, or again, a life partner that you feel like is truly someone that you would want to spend the rest of your life with, and they'd want to spend the rest of their life with you. So it's really important that you embed and articulate your values and character within your story. And I would say that once you do all 5 of these things, really, if you think about it as a metaphor, what you're doing is you're opening the door to yourself. So you're inviting someone into your life to be the next chapter, as your next employer, as your next classmate, as your next university, or as or your next customer. So you want to basically use your story to entice people, not push them into the door or push them through the door, but to pull them with you. And there are kind of tried and tested ways of doing that, a couple frameworks that we'll talk about in the following slides that you can use to your advantage when trying to build that story. So again, kind of just in other words, really, what are the main objectives of telling a good story? You want to humanize yourself as a unique story. You're not just one more stat. You're not just the 99th applicant. You are, for example, Nate Chan or Timothy or Lawrence. You're an individual, and your story is memorable. It deserves to be remembered. And so you want to make your story as unique, but as authentic as possible. Secondly, it's a natural response for human beings to have a resistance or a personal defense system. Basically, there's so many things that we can do with our time. Like, as with technology, we can watch any type of show on Netflix at any time, watch any music video on YouTube. Why should I spend 8 seconds of my time hearing your story? So you want to definitely find a way to use your story to disarm that natural resistance people have, because it's their choice if they want to listen to you or not. So you want to make sure that your hook, which we'll talk about, this is the beginning part of your story, your hook is as appealing and attractive as possible. And then finally, just going back to that really important point about connection, you want to build a connection with them so that they feel as though they know you, or that they feel as though they want to get to know you better through your story. So what are some actually tangible tips or takeaways that we can use as far as crafting a good story? And this is true whether it's a written story or today's online telling a story online. So the hook is basically the beginning of the story. So it's basically, for example, the first 2 to 3 lines of your story that you're going to say, and that is your chance to keep people tuning into your story. If you fail at the hook, people will just either log off the Zoom webcast or close their browser or whatever. I mean, that's your chance. So it's really important that your beginning, your hook is really strong. And in the middle of your story, you want to keep people entertained. And at the end, you want to finish strong so that they keep on wanting more. But the beginning is the most important, and that's called the hook. And we'll have some examples of some really very well done hooks that I found that I can kind of share with you. And then the second tip is about the importance, especially online, of using visuals. So studies have shown that today, in today's social media age, the average attention span is just 8 seconds. So basically, within 8 seconds, again, you have that amount of time to have an effective hook to keep someone watching your presentation. And our brains actually process visuals 60,000 times faster than text. That's why whether it's an Instagram story or a photojournalism, you're seeing that pictures and video are so much more effective as far as being able to influence people than just text, unless you're a really good writer. But still, just with today's attention span, it's very hard to keep people as hooked using text as it is using a video or a really strong and provocative photo. As well, 90% of the info transmitted to our brains is done so visually. So again, that just speaks to the fact that most of what we learn or most of what we remember is actually done through images as opposed to just words. And that people can remember 65% of the visual content they see 3 days later, whereas only 10% of the written content. So if I read an essay today, there's only a 10% chance that maybe 3 days from today, I might remember it. But if you present that essay in the form of a YouTube video and basically just capture the main points, there's a 65% chance or 55% higher of a chance that I would remember that 3 days later. So that just speaks to how important visual content is, which some people would say that's why video would take precedence over audio, and that would take precedence over written. And then finally, I would say you want to align your story across social media. So you want to keep a consistent story or a consistent image about you, whether it's on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter. I mean, again, you're not acting. You're not trying to present a false facade of who you are online. You want to present a consistent character. So, for example, if you're Leonardo DiCaprio, you don't want to be, say, the Wolf of Wall Street on LinkedIn, but then Jack Dawson on Twitter. You want to present a coherent, cohesive, believable image of who you are. So it's really important that your personal projection aligns across your different social media platforms. So this is kind of one infographic that I found that kind of encapsulates a lot of the most common ways of storytelling. So I'll just kind of briefly go through most of them. So you'll see on the bottom left, there's what's known as the petal structure approach, which is basically you tell stories one by one before returning back to the center. And this is really good for showing how different scenarios will relate back to one idea. So one example of this is, for example, I watched a YouTube video by a very popular speaker these days called Simon Sinek. And basically he speaks about how within companies, it's really important that the leaders know how to inspire their workers to action. So he gave examples of whether it's how the airplane came to be invented by the Wright brothers, who had a lot less funding or a lot less connections than who was supposed to basically be the first inventor of the airplanes, how they succeeded. He also presented other examples that showcase the same underlying story, and that is, for his story, that is that it's really up to the drive and the actions of the founders that will determine whether or not a company is successful. So he was able to basically articulate that in his TED Talk through the petal structure. You also have what's called the false start storytelling structure, and that is where you lure your audience in with a false sense of security. So you basically set it up where it's not where you expect the story to actually go. So for example, what you could say is, I just got off the phone with my client and I told him that I will buy his company within 2 weeks. Don't worry about it. But 2 weeks later, I called a call back, and it was actually him that said those words to me, and I had to eat my words. So basically, you're trying to set up, a beginning where, logically speaking, the viewers expect you to go one way, but you're actually going the different way. And the reason why you're doing that is to grab that attention, so that you have the audience craving the resolution to that story, and then you keep them wanting to listen to your story. So by disrupting their expectations, you grab their attention. Another kind of storytelling, way of doing it is the converging ideas way, which is to use a speech structure that shows the audience how different strands of thinking came together to form one idea. So you basically want to show how great minds came together. So one example is, say, the civil rights movement in the US in the 1960s. You can tell a story about Martin Luther King Jr. You can tell a story about Robert F. Kennedy. You can tell a story about Malcolm X, and how all those great minds individually came together to create what was a successful civil rights movement that ended up changing the course of American history. There's also some other ways that you'll see there, such as spark lines, nested loops, the in media res, the mountain, and the hero's journey. The one I want to focus on, because I think the one that is most relevant for people who have overcome adversity or people that have a resilient story to tell, is the hero's journey. So actually, it's actually the most common type of storytelling you'll see in Hollywood. You'll see basically in every form of storytelling medium that we have today. So what is the hero's journey? So basically, if you follow this chart, if you start at the beginning, at the start, we all kind of come into this world. We all kind of have a call to adventure. For some people, that might be exploring the wild, going to a different country that they've never been to, or trying on a new hobby that they've never tried. And then after that call to adventure, likely what happens is that they meet a mentor that will basically, either inspire them to dream for something more, or to teach them certain skills to trigger or activate that internal yearning to be something more. And they have to cross a threshold. And then after that, they come to experience certain trials and failures, because we all fail, in life. It's just a matter of how quickly you get up. So basically, after those trials and after you fail, hopefully you grow new skills. Once you grow new skills, though, again, you might fail again. So there's going to be basically a death and rebirth experience that you're gonna have to go through. And after that death and rebirth experience, there's a revelation that there was something inside you that was holding you back, or some secret power that you had to unlock. And then once you change that, once you atone for that, you get that gift. And then you'll see that at the end, whatever the original conflict or problem was, you will become the hero of that journey. So just one example of kind of how this hero's journey motif has been used. Think of the Lion King, right? So with Simba, basically when he was still a lion cub, he wanted to go and explore the dangerous parts of the jungle that his father Mufasa didn't want him to go. So he went to the land where the hyenas were. He was called to that adventure. And his mentor at that time was his father, the king, Mufasa, who he learned so much from. But kind of where he crossed his first threshold is when he, through his own, I guess, mischievousness, he kind of led his father to unfortunately being killed by his uncle Scar when he had, run off again to where he should not have gone. And then after that experience, he basically experienced a bit of a death, in the sense that he had to move away. He didn't want to confront the fact that, that he might have had some part to do with his father's death. So he ran away where nobody knew him. He met Timon and Pumbaa, and he basically wanted to avoid his responsibilities, avoid his destiny, avoid his fate as the next king, so that he could not have to confront, that ghost of his father inside of him. But he meets another mentor, which at this time is the monkey, Rafiki, who basically kind of, mystically shows him a vision that he is his father, that his father lives in him. And through that mystical experience, finally, Simba changes internally. He realizes that he cannot run away from his destiny, and he must, kind of claim his right to be king. And he goes back to Pride Rock. He confronts his uncle, he defeats his uncle, and he becomes the king. And he's become a different person. He's become an adult, not just no longer Simba the cub, but the adult king with the full mane of hair. And that kind of is just maybe the most popular example of a common hero's journey that we see in Hollywood that we all basically can all relate to as well. So again, I want to relate this back to, Phoenix Foundation and, kind of anyone who's overcome adversity. So actually human beings are very hardwired to enjoy a story of resilience. Studies have shown that what's called a post-traumatic growth story, these stories are as old as time. So whether it's in that cave painting that we talked about, or whether it's in a fairy tale, or whether it's in, on Facebook or LinkedIn today, people tend to like stories where it shows that somebody has overcome tragedy to triumph. Because I think we all know what it's like to go through tragedy, maybe to different degrees, but we all know what it's like to be down. And I think when we hear about someone else who has been able to overcome and conquer their personal demons to have that triumph, we find that inspiring. And that is the same if you're an American or somebody in China or somebody in Iran. It doesn't matter. I think as human beings, we are all inspired by people who have overcome, a tragic truth or a tragic tale. So two examples of that are Oprah and the founder of Starbucks, Howard Schultz. So in Oprah's case, she always talks about this. She actually was fired from being a reporter in Chicago. And, that was devastating for her. It was only after she got fired as a reporter that she, began to look into having her own TV show. And now, of course, she's one of the world's most, richest, most influential, most beloved television personalities of all time. So she's one example of that. Another example of somebody who has overcome adversity is Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks. He often talks about how when he was young, he was really poor. His father got a disability while working, and as a result, he was laid off his job. So his family became even more poor, and he basically had to grow up very quickly. He always tells this story to kind of, show people that, he had to build that resilience from an early age. So you will be inspired by people who have made it despite, the obstacles that have been put in front of them. So, these stories tend to be the ones that are the most inspiring, and that are the ones that we want to hear more and more of. So remember how I talked about the hook? So these are some examples of what a good hook might be. So, for example, I was homeless just 4 years ago. Today, I run a growing nonprofit. Within that opening line, you draw people in by showing, that by admitting to the fact that, you were homeless 4 years ago. Obviously, that was the low point. But today, you're running a growing nonprofit. Just by that first sentence, people will want to know how you got from A to B, how you went from homeless to having your own nonprofit. So that's a really good hook to get people, hooked into your story of overcoming your adversity. Another example is my life turned upside down when I was diagnosed with cancer. I had to ask myself, what was the one thing most important to me that I must accomplish before I leave this world? So I have friends who have been diagnosed with cancer. I know how it's totally changed their outlook on life and their goals given the new timeline that they had to actually work with. So I think when you tell an opening line like that, anyone who either has had cancer or knows somebody who has had cancer, which is probably around 80% of the population, they can begin to feel that empathy to hear about the rest of your story. So I think that's also a very good hook. And I think just thinking about today with COVID-19, how many people do you know that have lost their job due to this pandemic? How many people do you know who have lost a family member, a parent or a grandparent that has been killed by the virus? So I think you can think of many different examples where this resilient hook can be a really effective opening line to inspire people to hear the rest of your story. So again, I'm going to go back to just, the Steve Jobs example. So you might have, heard or seen this before on YouTube, but Steve Jobs has, he had a very famous commencement speech at Stanford, I think in the early 2000s. So there's three main elements of his speech. The first is what's known as the inciting incident. This is again kind of the part where it's your personal tragedy that he expressed. So his inciting incident was that we had just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I had just turned 30, and then I got fired. So in that opening, in that line, he kind of expressed both his ups, the fact that he had finally released his best product at that time, which was the Macintosh, and he had just turned 30, and usually, as an entrepreneur, back then 30 was kind of the golden age. And then unfortunately he got fired. So that was kind of the tragedy after that initial joy. And then, through that tragedy, he goes on to talk about his personal transformation. And for him, he says, I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. So he transformed a tragedy into a personal transformation of how something bad and sad that happened, how that actually gave him room to grow. It gave him room to grow a part of him that he previously didn't have the time or energy to actually grow. So that's how you transform through that adversity. And then finally, his life lesson. This is the part of your story that anyone can relate to, that anyone can take from and can learn from. So his life lesson for all of us, based upon his experience, is that your time is limited. Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. And I think that last line is something you hear from entrepreneurs today from all walks of life. So that's a life lesson that through Steve's own experience managed to change the lives of founders and startup people for decades to come. So also, I just kind of wanted to go back to the different mediums to tell a story online. So let's talk about basically your resume. So, within the past 10 years, some people have begun to use what are known as infographic resumes, which is what you see on the right. So if you compare kind of the traditional resume on your left with just text to the one on the right, which one do you think, if you're looking at a pile of 100 resumes, which one do you think you're going to find more visually appealing? Which one do you think you'll remember more? Which one do you think would interest you to actually want to call that person back? I think most people might pick the one on the right. And there's actually many both free and paid visual resume websites that you can find online. For example, there's ResumeUp, which is ResumeUp.com. There's visualize.me that you can use. I think those two are free, where you can basically craft a resume like the one on the right. And I think especially for a creative job, like for example, if you're a marketer or if you're a UI or a user experience, looking for those kind of jobs, I think the resume on the right might be most effective as far as showcasing both your artistry, your creativity, your aesthetic, as well as your actual qualifications. And then as far as, kind of the written word, so more and more you're seeing people on LinkedIn, right, kind of, as I think, mentioned by Timothy as well, kind of, writing articles, writing more long stories. So especially now for me, when I'm on LinkedIn, I see a lot of people have lost their jobs due to COVID, and they're not shy to admit it online. And they'll tell their story about how they lost their job. They were laid off, not through their own fault, but because of the pandemic. And by telling that story, I've seen a lot of people, have their your LinkedIn profiles or their CVs being recommended to employers all around the world. So by telling a story like the one you see on the left, this person, he didn't, I don't think he found a new job, but he's actually become a full-time writer. So through that, one post, that very, vulnerable, very touching, very real post, he got 17,000, reactions, over 1,000 comments, and basically people offering him jobs, offering him to be a writer and to continue writing about, what he's learned. So that's kind of one example of how storytelling online can be very effective. For me, when it comes to like writing or blogging, the one I like most is Medium, medium.com, which you see on the right. It's very user-friendly. You have the ability to highlight text. You have the ability to make text, a different size. So whatever kind of quote or whatever main point you want to drive home, you can increase that, that text size so it really sticks out within the layout of your article. So if you want to kind of, look into writing, look into, storytelling online, I think Medium, it's a free service that you might want to look into. It's really effective when it comes to blogging. When it comes to kind of Instagram, I just want to share two examples that I personally like. Of course, they're both famous, with Jeremy Lin and Michelle Obama. But I wanted to share the one about Jeremy Lin that he posted on Instagram because although I think his text might have been a bit too long, what I liked about it is that he kind of tells both his own story, but he weaves that into the large story of what everyone's going through with COVID. So he basically talks about how with COVID in China, where he's playing now, the basketball association was canceled. And he kind of talks about how, he understands, that that's something that we're all going through, but he also relates that to his own personal experience of just, for him, kind of, what that means, which means just more time in the weight room, more time exercising. He knows, that he's been through something similar with the 2011 lockout in the NBA. So being able to kind of weave your own story within the larger narrative, I think, is a very powerful tool, because it shows people your story, but it shows that you're not very self-centered. Your story is just one of many stories, and that they can relate to your story because they're going through something similar. And then the other kind of example from Michelle Obama that I wanted to kind of talk about is, you'll see a lot of different hashtag campaigns depending on, whatever the day is. So here it's National Siblings Day that she's hashtag. She uses that hashtag to basically tell and share a photo of her and her brother. So you're always going to find ways on social media or on Facebook to, to use hashtags, whether it's Black Lives Matter or National Siblings Day or Earth Day, Earth Hour, to kind of, showcase something that you care about, or a value that you have, or somebody that matters to you. So I think those are two good examples that I've seen recently. As far as video, one of the kind of YouTube channels I really like is Goalcast. So Goalcast, they basically kind of tell stories about inspirational people that have overcome adversity to become very successful. So this is one from this guy named Jay Shetty, who I think he quit his job in the corporate world to become a monk for 3 years. And after he became a monk, he began really sharing what he learned during those 3 years. And now he's, a KOL and an influencer online. He gets paid to make speeches. So I wanted to actually highlight this example because it's not too long of a video, just around 3 minutes. But I like how Goalcast uses both, the video and audio to really tell a really touching story. And a lot of the video that they use that you'll see here, aside from the speaker speaking, a lot of it you can actually get for free on YouTube. If you make a video, there are certain Creative Commons kind of, free video footage that you can use to incorporate into your video. And I think they've used that. So I think it's one good example of, if you wanted to tell a video story, how to do it on YouTube. So I'll just play that video right now very quickly. Okay, it's just loading here.
Brian Shaw is also a guy who...
It's the ad right now. We're just gonna
yeah.
The ad. Although this guy also tells really good stories as well.
That's when you're meant to be settling down. You can't change your career at 35. You should have had it figured out by then. Oh my God, you're not married at 38? What the hell are you doing with your life? Who comes up with this stuff? I have no idea. But this stuff plagues so many people that I speak to. So many people open up to me and say, Jay, I just don't know how to change. Is it possible? What do you think this guy was before he became who he is? He used to be a PE teacher, right? Sports teacher at a high school. How about her? She was a telemarketer for 2 weeks. How about her? She applied to be a funeral director. It's incredible. What happens in society is that we're clouded by the noise of family expectations, the noise of our parents, the noise of our brothers and sisters' expectations. I grew up in a family where you could either be a doctor, a lawyer, or a failure, right? Those were my 3 options. Anything else would just count me as a failure. I would have failed. So basically I failed, right? I'm standing up here in front of you all as a failure. I lived as a monk for 3 years. I committed career suicide. I turned down 2 amazing corporate job offers when I graduated from business school. I shaved my hair, I wore robes, and lived out of a gym locker for 3 years. And I did that because I thought I was going to do something meaningful, help impact the world. And it was one of the best experiences of my life. But more than becoming a monk, what that trained me to do was drop out of the rules. People told me, if you come back in 3 years, you'll never get a job. They told me, if you become a monk, people are going to think you're weird forever. No girl's ever going to talk to you. People told me, they were like, well, when you come back to real life, like, will you even be able to talk English? And people were just really weirded out. I'm just like, okay, I think monks speak English. And there was so much different noise that I was hearing when I made that decision. And the funny thing is, from having not been a monk for 4 years now, I'm in one of the most incredible periods of my life that I could ever have asked for. And so much of that is based on the fact that I decided to do something different. So many of the times our expectations are driving us in a certain scenario. We focus so much on life in what we want to be as opposed to who we want to be. Because we've always been told that life and jobs and careers are like boxes and containers. There's only a finite number of options. There is no formula, there is no pattern. If you know what you're passionate about, if you know what you're good at, and you invest in that. People say follow your passions, I say forget that, invest in your passion. If you're passionate about something, go and become the best at it. Go and do a course on it. Go and learn from the best. Go and find a mentor who's going to make you incredible at that trait. Not only will you be criticized and grow, you'll be able to find new things about yourself that you never knew. Don't trade who you are for who you think the world needs. Because the world needs you to be you. And I mean that.
Yep, so that's it for me. Thanks for your time. Feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn or Facebook. I'll type my details within the chat. And yeah, thank you. And then I'll turn it back to Clive.